You're right, folks, and welcome back. Cataclysm was a very ambitious expansion, and for better or for worse, a lot of things were changed or updated, and dungeons were no exception. So today we're going to go over a couple of things you can expect to see in 5-man content come Cataclysm Classic. First thing I want to mention then is the loot roll system and some changes it'll face in Cataclysm. Now, it's not been massively overhauled or anything like that, but there are a couple of tweaks when it comes to group loot, primarily in the RDF. You will now no longer be able to roll need on an item Blizzard believe your class would reasonably not be able to use. For example, a warrior cannot just roll need on cloth. Naturally, that does make sense, but this paired with the armor type specialization passive that crops up this expansion, which is something you will learn from a class trainer at level 50, which will give you an increase to primary stats if you wear a specific type of armor in all slots, so plate for DKs, warriors, paladins, etc., mails for shamans and hunters. It's where Blizzard really started pushing the idea of classes only gearing certain ways, which does remove a lot of the freedom and RPGness from gearing that has been present in Classic up to this point, but it does mean rogues and ferals will no longer have to endure the pain of watching a warrior walk away with their best in slot boots for the 15th time. Now, it doesn't count for every item. Cloaks and rings, for example, regardless of stats, can be rolled on by near enough everyone, but that's because an item like that could be reasonably used by several classes of differing armor types in equal measure. This will also provide a bit of protection from ninjas and for the lone pug in a group. What does that mean? Well, the ninja thing is fairly obvious. If you get a tank that's in a mood, they won't be able to run off with all the items, though I'm sure they'll try. As for pug protection, I give you this example from my experience doing Gamma dungeons via the RDF. There have been times I've queued up, joined a dungeon, and I've been the odd one out in an otherwise full guild group. On more than one occasion, that guild group has just rolled on everything and then distributed the gear amongst themselves after the dungeon was complete. Not long after my mage hit level 80, I ended up in such a group for Gundrak. In there was another mage along with 3 of his guildies. A belt dropped from the Colossi boss, an upgrade, and everyone needed on it, including the warrior tank and DK DPS. The warrior 1 and his mage friend ended up wearing the item. This is now a thing of the past for the most part. If it's a gear stacked group, yeah, it might still happen. Not much you can do about that, sadly. But in a situation like the one I was in, you'd only be up against people who can actually use the item, which is how it should be. So how does this work for classes that use multiple armor types throughout their leveling? Well, up until level 40, hunters and shamans are able to roll on leather items, and paladins and warriors can roll on mail. But after this, they'll only be able to roll on mail and plate respectively, as that's what will become their primary armor type, although, if memory serves, there was a slight overlap at around the 40 mark. There will also be a new option added for when an item crops up for group loot, Disenchant. Self-explanatory really, you click that, if you win the roll the item gets nuked and you receive some relevant enchanting materials. Pretty cool and useful across the board, however, it's only an option if there is an enchanter in your party with the relevant skill level, so you can't just have a random alt with level 1 enchanting in an endgame heroic and expect to get the shinies. If you played back in the day, you will know this is actually a Wrath feature that was part of the original Dungeon Finder, but just didn't rear its head in Classic. However, in a post-BlizzCon Q&A, they have confirmed it will be returning in Cataclysm. Then we have the Dungeon Finder itself. You may be going, well, that's not a change, we already have that. Yeah, we do now, but we didn't at the start of Wrath. Like the original, this is going to be the first expansion where it's going to be available from the get-go, meaning the concept of the leveling dungeon is something that we will all be much more familiar with, especially from 80 to 85. As such, your LFG channel is most likely going to be people trying to put together some dungeon spam groups with obscene gear requirements early on in order to farm dungeons for as much XP as is humanly possible. And at max level, there should be folk trying to get some heroic groups going, particularly in the early days, in order to bypass the item level requirement for queuing for heroics through the RDF, or, depending on the version of heroics we get, just guaranteeing they have the toolkit necessary to even complete the damn dungeon. But if you aren't doing that, the RDF is probably going to be a place you practically live in the first weeks of Cataclysm. If we get the harder version of heroics, however, then I would definitely advise making some friends and wrangling some guildies in order to effectively partake in that content. Heroic Plus. In Wrath, we know this as the Titan Rune system. For those unaware, it's a mode of dungeon where at its most basic, your group opt into a harder version of the instance with theoretically more challenging mechanics in order to get greater rewards than your standard 5-man, usually meaning loot from a previous raid tier. Throughout Wrath, we've had 3 versions of this dungeon mode, and during BlizzCon and on the Cata Classic page, they have made it very clear this is a system we will see at some point in Cata, most likely in either patch 4.1 or 4.2. Again, like the RDF, this is the first expansion where we go into things knowing this is coming and expecting it as part of the regular 5-man content lineup. If you are new to Classic or Cataclysm, this is the go-to daily dungeon system in Wrath and will most likely be in Cataclysm as well. Because other than just granting greater rewards than your average dungeon, it's where you go to farm badges on a daily basis, or in the case of Cata, Valor and Justice points. And it's not just the higher end that sees some changes. Dungeons from 1 to 60 have had their level ranges tweaked to be more in line with the zones they're in, meaning you will probably be partaking in this content at a lower level than previous expansions. For example, a lot of early dungeons now have their ranges starting at level 15. This is because this is the level the Dungeon Finder feature becomes available, and with the exception of Ragefire Chasm, most of the early dungeons in Vanilla, TBC, Wrath, etc. aren't really content that you tackle until level 20. That's not to say in those expansions you couldn't enter the instances and give them a crack at a lower level, but because a lot of dungeons had quite a wide level range, with the early mobs starting at 16 or 17, and the final boss being much higher at, say, level 25, a party of level 15s trying to do that dungeon wouldn't have had the best chance of actually completing it, especially in Vanilla. I'll leave a link to a post made by Blizzard back in the day documenting the alterations should you wish to peruse yourself. But as I said, this is from 1 to 60 with a decent handful of instances even being updated to a degree to reflect the changes of the zones they're located in. Deadmines and Shadowfang are prime examples and are low-level instances that will actually be available as heroics at max level. There's also a pretty significant quality of life update to dungeon quests in Cataclysm. Instead of potentially being locked behind a long chain which requires you to essentially complete the entire zone, or being spread to the farthest corners of the world, any relevant quests are actually placed at the entrance of the instance, be that quest givers or the system in Cata whereby the quest just magically appears in your log because you passed a checkpoint or something to that effect. And previously, where quests might only be available to a single faction because of the zone the dungeon is located in most cases this has been remedied in Cataclysm, and both factions will be able to benefit from dungeon quests even for instances that your faction would have no earthly business going to. This is designed to work in tandem with the RDF more than anything, because there's no guarantee you'll actually be questing in the zone or even on the same continent of a dungeon that you've just been placed in via the Dungeon Finder. And the chances of you actually having quests for, say, Moradon whilst you're still fanning around in Stranglethorn are actually pretty low. This is obviously less of an issue in previous expansions where the RDF isn't a thing, because either you'll pick up the quests en route to the dungeon, or you will plan at the very least your first foray into an instance around you having completed the necessary prerequisites in order to pick up all the related dungeon quests, which is what I do in Classic. I will not set foot in a dungeon for the first time without having all my ducks lined up, as it were. And Cataclysm is very much an expansion of level as quickly as you can to get to the end. It just is. It doesn't detract from updated zones that much because they're still cool, but the sheer amount of XP bonuses like heirlooms, guild perks, quest streamlining, reduced XP requirements per level, and I'm sure something like joyous journeys at some point, having all the dungeon quests front-loaded the second you enter an instance is something that contributes massively to that increased leveling speed as well, because they give a hell of a lot of XP and it does make dungeon leveling much more attractive. Anyway, that's that for now. I might revisit some of these points a bit more in depth once Cataclysm is out. The new Heroic Plus, for example, and there might even be some new bits and pieces we didn't see the first time round that have yet to be made public, in which case I might talk about those too. There was also a comment on one of the other videos I put out recently asking if I had any plans to cover the Cata instances one by one and essentially make a sort of guide. I have actually thought about that because it really does interest me from a content creation standpoint, and because Cata dungeons were just really good fun and I'm always down for an excuse to go and do them. And if I'm lucky and get a beta key, that is something I will be doing in one form or another. And the biggest reason I'm waiting for something like that is mainly down to the fact we just don't know what version of the dungeons we are getting yet. And I would want to do that properly, give feedback where needed, and just do it justice. And whilst I'm happy to fiddle around with certain servers for a brief outline of things like, here's how leveling works, reps are important, here's where you go, here's what you do, yada yada, it would just feel really disingenuous to advise and make a guide based on potentially skewed and just all-round iffy private server numbers where endgame content is concerned. At the end of the day, the only numbers and metrics that matter for this sort of thing are Blizzard's, and there's no point in making a guide saying, this trash pack sucks ass, you need to use this type of CC and this tactic to defeat it, if what Blizzard then delivers can be blown over by a mildly brisk breeze, or vice versa. And if no beta, I'll just wait and go ham once the expansion hits and get it all done then. So, let me know your own thoughts down below. Be so kind as to like, subscribe, show your pals and so on. That'll be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.